Okay, so as to say, welcome to this panel on representation and ethics. Our first speaker today is Eric Deutsch. Eric is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Buffalo in Buffalo, New York. He has a BA from the University of Miami and a JD from Emory University School of Law. At University of Buffalo, he researches and produces work most centrally involving disability history in the United States through an approach that prioritizes animals as rehabilitative tools in American rehabilitation programs in the 20th century. So if you're all ready to go, I will let people know that the title of your paper is quite long.
You can read the one that's on the screen if you want.
No. I'm gonna do the whole thing that's here. The Interwar period United States guide dog movement as enhancing and complicating understandings of the human-animal bond. Subtitle: Researching and analyzing a case study representing an intersection of critical animal studies and critical disability studies. Over to you, Eric.
Beautiful. No, I might have you read the audiobook of the dissertation. I appreciate it. I think everybody's research has adjusted over the last year due to the COVID-19 outbreak and then our great government's response to it all. So it's taken me on quite a bit of a journey, including a lot of a CAS theory that I wasn't expecting to get into. But once, so I was on research year. Last year, I had my project approved in February to be defended in April before my committee, so that my committee would approve me to go on my travel, and then in March 2020 happened. So I had to pretty much read everything that I can get my hands on without visiting any of the places that I had initially sought to go to, which included a lot of theory that I wasn't too thrilled about, but then I got enmeshed into critical animal studies. I'm in critical disability studies is my sub-discipline within the university's history department. And this, I think Dr. Parkinson will enjoy. This is like going to be a Christopher Nolan-esque PowerPoint. It might not make sense until the end if it does at all. But the slide, this is one of the early adopters, Hazel Hurst, with her guide dog, Babe. She was trained at the Seeing Eye, and there are probably a few things I'll need to contextualize along the way, especially for Europeanists and people from other continents. But that's the first major institution to train guide dogs in the United States. It was formed in the late 1920s in Nashville. It now exists where it moved in the early 30s, which is in Morristown, New Jersey. So both on the East Coast, but New Jersey is quite a bit further north. So it's much more temperate and they can train year round, whereas Nashville is way too warm. So I wanted to start with this, which may be the least relevant for what I'm going to talk about, but I think it might connect the three presentations a little best. These are three just representations that I found last year over the course of reading through a ton of journals that were pretty much showing things that they would not have made sense if you showed me these three pictures a year ago. But I think in terms of what they represent, it's the discourse that's shown to the American public in the mid 20th century from pretty much the 30s to the 50s about animals' places in the lives of disabled people. The first picture is a guide dog getting his own graduation picture, independent from the blind student who's graduating alongside this beautiful little pup. In the middle is a quote unquote catty suffragette, which with a nice poem. And then the right is a representation that this is in a journal for blind or for rehabilitationist professionals for blind people. My random phone is random. Shut that off. So this is a representation of what disabled people were treated like and considered. So there's a lot of anthropomorphism here, but also this reverse anthropomorphism where disabled people were kind of endowed with animalistic tendencies, and so they're happiest when they're allowed to kind of become their inner animal, and that'll come out a little clearer. But I also think these three pictures are speak quite a bit for themselves. So very briefly, some examples of anthropomorphism I found. And again, if you have any specific questions about context, I will provide my email address. There's a lot to get here. I'm summing up, a year of a lot of research. But we have guide dogs presented in the 20s and through the 1930s, the decade almost speak about as, quote, his master's eyes, which is actually the name of one of the institutions that opens. And so it was trying to tell the American public that was a little hesitant to adopt or to embrace the guide dog, that the guide dog represented his master's eyes. It wasn't just a dog, it wasn't just a German Shepherd that was endangering the public, but it was supposed to be an extension of the blind user owner's humanity. The guide dog was considered a living prosthetic, so that goes along with the idea that the guide dog was his master's eyes. And the death of a few of the prominent guide dogs, especially Morris Frank, who started the Seeing Eye, which I've spoken about. So he had Buddy, and I'll probably mention Buddy a few times here. When Buddy dies in the late 1930s, there are a lot of posthumous memorializations and poems submitted to either Morris Frank. There's interesting stuff that's archived in the Seeing Eyes archive. There's stuff all across national newspapers. People feel connection to Buddy and feel like there is a death of a human. And so the good death is it's considered Victorian era, but I don't want to offend the British historians here. But it's considered a relic of the Victorian era during the Civil War for American soldiers that were dying in horrific ways that the American public just could not conceive of. When people would inform family members that their son, their beloved brother, their husband had died, and who knows what had happened to their body, they were presented as having died alongside a nurse, saying, whispering last words that were, tell my wife I love her, tell my mother I love her, and it was presented in this very clean way, and this good death gets enmeshed, and you can see relics of that and echoes of that in the 1930s when these dogs are dying. Now these reverse anthropomorphism, which I kind of captured in that third picture on the first slide. The guide dog is presented and sold to the American public as a rehabilitative tool, permitting a blind user to reclaim his and most of the graduates, I think over 75% of them, the first decade of the Seeing Eye is in use are men. So I don't mean to offend anybody, but they are predominantly a him, his, that they allow the blind man to return to the public space unencumbered or allowed to circumvent the structural barriers that it takes another decade to begin to unravel through federal law. And that through the dog, they can reclaim their citizenship by going back to the workplace, and that the dog in turn, in a way, then can endow their owner, who is a human, with this humanity. So I have a few quotes here that speak for this, and I'm just going to say the things that I highlight. So I promise not to be that teacher that reads every word, but if I do a little bit more, I beg your apology. And Dr. Parkinson, you can scream it, and I do have a tendency to ramble. So this is somebody who writes for one of, in 1941 about guide dogs for the blind, saying that, when one witnesses one of these guide dogs training, it is bewildering. One is sometimes tempted, I need to move my screen, to think that in their case, the line between animal and human has been crossed, and that their achievements give evidence of reflective, rational thought. So there's humanity that people are thinking, the supernatural humanity that these guide dogs are exemplifying or exuding, that is visible or illustrated by the guide dog's operation. We're going in a little different direction, but connecting CAS to CDS through my project. So looking at guide dogs as kind of technological innovations to serve disabled people. I think Rollstone, who writes a little bit about animal ethics and technology, particularly, he says that the emphasis in the social model of disability on a wider access and barrier reduction level may have inadvertently left micro-level influence over wheelchair research and design, the principal domain of non-disabled experts. So in so far as connecting the guide dog to the wheelchair, is that using the guide dog, you're trying to, again, circumvent these socio-legal barriers to access in the public space to reclaim your citizenship. That ends up taking a back, so changing the structural accessibility limitations takes a backseat to guide dogs, like wheelchairs, becomes kind of almost status symbols that the person using these technological devices is seeking to overcome their disability and reclaim their space or their stature in mainstream technology and reclaim their citizenship. So this again leads to a question, since guide dogs are bred, and I say eugenic principles kind of guide the way, is there a point at which their apparent agency becomes a manifestation of human programming, that they cross a line between technology and animal? So questions about agency and independent thought become blurred, incredibly blurred in a way that I can barely verbalize here. Dorothy Eustace was the money behind the Seeing Eye, and she spoke very frequently at events that were fundraising for the Seeing Eye, talking about how the guide dog, when they would train the guide dog, he would work, especially with intelligence disobedience, which is doing something or doing nothing if your owner was telling you to do something, or doing the opposite if your owner was telling you to do another thing, to keep your user owner out of danger, harm's way. So they were saying that the dog was doing this of his own volition, and let his master know why. This is through harness communication. The command was disobeyed and what he must do to arrive at the object safely. So if the dog's refusal to obey certain commands is at his own volition, again, questions about whether the guide dog represents a technology more than it does an animal, or where that line is and what it actually means regarding the dog's agency, and also the fact that it had to be sold to the American public in a way that it was not considered a German Shepherd, which I believe the British far more, but in the 1930s, especially as we get post-war, are connected with accompanying Nazi guards, and their connotation in American circles is not easily overcome. So these attitudes get changed by messages like the one we saw Eustace. That's Morris Frank and Buddy on the left side of your screen. Again, he says the blind person must do his own talking. The dog can only serve him. The dog must not be credited with having supernatural or even human powers. So he drew his own line between the dog is his animal, while selling the dog in other ways along the lines. He would say things like Eustace was saying about how the dog was endowed with things that looked supernatural, but were taught. So again, the idea of what then is in the dog's power, which actions reflect this independent thought and agency versus which just reflect what he is taught by humans and bred by humans to portray, so that everything that he shows, every behavior, every response, is actually just a manifestation of the human breeding and not of his animality. So we're getting into the stuff you guys all came here to avoid, which is the theory of CAS. So we're connecting CAS to CDS in my project, which has been one of the central, challenges, but also opportunities for me. And so my focus is generally a sociocultural history of disability in the US. Fudge says it's the duty of historians of animals to understand and analyze the uses to which animals were put. If we ignore the very real impact of human dominion, whether in meat eating, sport, or work, we are ignoring the fundamental role animals have played in the past. So my work is really challenged, especially in the context, and why I put the slides before. So in the context that animals were shown as being technological innovations by humans, how do we bridge the gap between critical disability studies, which centers people, disabled people who are considered animals, and through most of the time that I am researching, as well as animals that are considered for the purpose of changing American behavior as people. So we get into a little more. We have researchers saying that critical animal studies interrogates how the societal privileging of humans, more specifically non-disabled humans, contributes to the domination and mistreatment of non-human animals, which leads to my second question, which might be a little more challenging, and I don't expect an answer. I don't think we're going to get to one in my department, certainly, is how is this tenet, if it is one of CAS, where disabled humans are the exception to domination of animals when they are used by people, how is that challenged and complicated by the fact that what I am looking at is disabled people using the animals for their purpose and exploiting animals in their own way. And it is a team effort, but it's also one that reflects human domination before that. Is that gap decreased, or is that space challenged by the fact that disabled humans are the ones, quote unquote, dominating animals? And then the same two researchers say, some argue that when a dog becomes a service dog, they are enslaved to the humans that they are paired with. So again, all challenged. We have other researchers saying by studying the historical positioning of animals at the shifting boundaries between medicine, veterinary medicine, and the life sciences, it will cast new light on the relationship between these fields. So again, this is inspiration for me to kind of look at the public discourse and ethics and discussion of ethics concerning disability and disabled people using guide dogs as kind of shaping thoughts about the other. So it talks about guide dogs shaping how we talk about disabled people, talks about disabled people shaping how we discuss service animals through the 1920s and 30s. So looking at what Woods says, that historians have an moral obligation to document how human actions have impacted animal lives. So human or historians drawing from CAS and CDS, this is my kind of moral imperative, to document how human actions have impacted disabled people utilizing animals as rehabilitative tools. So where does that domination cross another line between use and exploitation? What did the guide dog movement do? This is bringing it back to critical disability studies. So guide dogs were not used by a great majority of blind Americans who were kept out of mainstream American culture. So what does the domination of animals mean to these other people? We have a lot of some talk by Gary Marvin. So I use what he wrote to say, engage with guide dogs and disabled people as historical actors who both have socially constructed identities. Both animals and disabled people through history have been marginalized historically, through their historical agency has been marginalized and confined by able-bodied people emboldened by a society so structured to empower them and to marginalize these two actors. So I wrote a little bit more, and I'll finish up shortly, about just the animality of disabled people through the centuries as presented to Americans who are very fascinated with the presentation of disabled people. You have Bedlam in England. You have a lot of asylums through the 19th century that are open to the public.
Eric, two minutes. 2 minutes.
Phenomenal. That is,
okay.
Thank you so much. So we're going to go to agency, which is everybody's favorite. So William H. Sewell has written, to be an agent means to be capable of exerting some degree of control over the social relations in which one is enmeshed, which implies the ability to transform those social relations. Shaw defines historical agency as minimally someone without whom things, especially a particular doing, might have been significantly different. So one of the questions that I've had to engage with or choose to engage with, because I'm a masochist, is how are the guide dogs that are present in my project that I want to respect their individuality, possess agency and or historical agency independent of the user with whom they are paired, which gets into my final slide, which is whether, this is the second slide, which gets into whether the dual agency between guide dogs and the user owner who is using them and owning them and exploiting them in a way, whether they, like Shaw writes, are become a fused sort of powerful thing, a unity with qualities distinct from either of the components, and whether this extends to agency that can be seen independent of two actors but becomes dual. So this is the quote unquote answer at ANT, and I'm trying to keep my project as focused on critical disability studies as possible, like getting way too formulaic, or theoretic. But I do need to respect ANT as an interesting theory. So it does emphasize non-traditional agents as historic actors, which would certainly include guide dogs. So we're looking at whether agency has been historically considered in ways that would fit within the way that we consider agency vis-a-vis ANT, in a way that would respect disabled people and guide dog users as individuals or as a team. So lots of questions that are unanswered remain unanswerable, and I look forward to my the two other presentations for being much more founded in an answer. So thank you, everybody, and I hope that was okay. Thanks, Dr. Parkinson.
Thanks very much, Eric. And I know that we've already got questions in the chat for you, so I'm sure there's going to be some interesting discussion at the end of this. Thank you so much. So we move on to our next paper, and we actually have 3 presenters for this paper, and they are okay. I can see we've got some screen sharing happening already. Thank you for that. So our next presenters are Núria Almiron, who is an associate professor at Universitat-Pompeu Fabra, UPF, in Barcelona, Spain. And Professor Almiron's main research areas are critical animal and media studies, the ethics and political economy of communication, interest groups and advocacy regarding the climate emergency and non-human animals oppression. She's published more than 50 peer-reviewed articles, and wait for it, she is the author, co-author or editor of 30 volumes. That's 30 people, 30 volumes. Fantastic, Núria. I'm always so impressed.
Everything in team.
These include the absolutely sensational co-edited book Critical Animal and Media Studies, and Public Relations and Climate Change Denial. She's the co-director of the UPF Centre for Animal Ethics, the director of Think Climate Research Project, and the director of the MA in International Studies in Media, Power and Difference. And the other presenters are Laura Fernández, who is a critical animal studies researcher. She has a BA in social and cultural anthropology, an MA in international studies on media, film and difference from UPF. And she's currently doing her PhD research in communication about strategic visual communication and moral shocks in the international animal liberation movement. And Laura is a member of the UPF Critical Communication Research Group and the UPF Centre for Animal Ethics. She's also the author of a book. I'm going to do the English translation, which is Towards More Animal Worlds, which was published in 2018. And we also have Olatz Aranceta-Reboredo, if I pronounced that correctly. Olatz, I hope so, who has a BA in English Studies with a minor in European Culture and Literature, and is currently a student at the MA in International Studies in Media, Power and Difference at UPF. And Olatz is a student intern at the Centre for Animal Ethics at UPF. So it looks like everybody is ready to go here. And I will hand over to our 3 presenters.
Yes, actually, I just apologize because my 2 co-authors are doing the hard work and allow me to rest a bit, so they will be the presenters.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Thank you, Claire, for the introduction. So Olatz and me are going to present this, our paper, our research, conducted collectively by the 3 of us. And we have titled it Inspiring Animal Liberation, the representation of animal activists in US animal advocacy documentaries from 2000 to 2019. And I would like to say that we are going to publish this research, so we are looking forward to your feedback at the end. And now my colleague Olatz, they is going to present the introduction.
Thank you, Laura. Well, given that we want to focus more on the methodology and the results and discussion for feedback purposes, we will briefly go through the introduction and the literature review that we conducted previous to the research. So to start with, where did this research come from? It came from this interest on the auto-representation of animal activists in what we consider to be one of the most important tools that social justice movements have, the activist documentaries. We're interested in knowing how much animal advocates are depicted or self-depicted in animal advocacy as an enactment of the values of compassion, truth, nonviolence, and justice. As mentioned by Kim Stalwood, and how this was reflected in the framing of these human advocates related to their personal profiles and actions. So we consider this research on activist representation important, especially in the context of documentaries, because these are effective tools to promote veganism and inspire also new activists into the activism for animal liberation. As for example, this study from 2 years ago shows of how a feature-length documentary is amongst the main reasons to make people consider going vegan. When it comes to a literature review, we ended up dividing the frames in 3 main groups. The first one being how human advocates are shown in relation to their personal profile. Here we found converts, justice advocates, grassroots people, vegan elite, and heroes. Within the frame of heroes, it is really interesting to see how 4 different frames are overlapping and happening at the same time, which is that one of moral agents, social justice advocates, the savior, and the educated hero. To continue with, we can find the framing of human advocates in relation to their actions. Here they can be framed as terrorists, welfareists, moral entrepreneurs, and conducting risky actions. And finally, the framing of non-human animals as activists for their own cause. Here we will further develop next, but we are talking about the coding of Telecom from Blackfish as an activist for his own rights.
Yes. Well, regarding methodology, to start with, we have selected documentaries following 4 main criteria. And that was, we analyzed not only non-fiction animal advocacy documentaries, therefore we excluded nature documentaries and health-oriented documentaries and fiction films. Then we looked at the documentaries depicting activists, human activists in a relevant way. So we excluded those who had no explicit profiles for advocates, despite being purely animal defense films, for instance, Earthlings. Then we focused on US-produced documentaries. And also we analyzed those documentaries that were accessible to us in the research team, both online and in DVD. Now we are going to show you our sample of documentaries. So to start with, we analyzed The Witness, also Lolita, Slave to Entertainment, Visible Kingdom, The Journey Home, Behind the Mask, I'm an Animal, the story of Ingrid Newkick and Peta, The Cove, Both Native, Begucated, Speciesism, the movie, Blackfish, Conspiracy, Tyke the Elephant Outlaw, Unlocking the Cage, Vegan Everyday Stories, Food Choices, 73 Cows, and finally, A Prayer for Compassion, The Animal People, The Subjects, and The Invisible Vegan. So this was just for you to have a look. Of course, we would like to have more time to be there. But, well, our methodology was coding. We, as Olatz explained, we borrowed some frames from previous literature, and then we also built some new frames from our discussions and our own analysis. And basically here you can see our coding sheet. We created like a coding book, and together we analyzed the documentaries. We were 3 coders, Olatz, me, and a colleague who was hired for this task. And we make together like 3 pilots, and we arrived to a 0.89 intercoding reliability following the phrase kappa equation, which is kind of a good undercoder reliability number. And I think you can go to the next slide. And Olatz is going to introduce, the frames more in detail.
Thank you. So here we were going to offer some examples and further explanation of these frames. As Laura just explained, we used some that were previously identified by other researchers, but then we ended up adding or defining further certain frames while we were coding the documentary. So to start with the frame of the convert, Nonhuman coined this mention as an animal exploiter who has become an activist for non-human animal rights. So this person has to have a past as an exploiter. It's not just about becoming an animal activist. This was coined after Rico Berry, and it is also used by Freeman and Tulloch when referring to Howard Lehman as a rancher turned vegan. Then advocates made in real time, freedom fighters, heroes, vegan elite. This refers to a certain level of elitism as people who themselves try to define what all veganism is. Here we can see that it is not very oftenly, it doesn't appear very often in the documentaries, but still we thought that it was interesting to include. Then when it comes to social justice advocates, Freeman talks about how in the Cove, the activists are implicitly shown as similar to human rights activists in their willingness to take risks, breaking the laws in a non-violent way in order to save the victims from unjust suffering. Other documentaries, such as in Behind the Mask, there's a parallel made by using quotes and frames by Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, and Nelson Mandela, for example. In the social justice advocates, there are two different approaches that overlap. One is the one that compares the violence exerted towards non-human animals and human animals. And the other one is one that highlights intersectionalities between oppressions that is, for example, visible in the invisible vegan. Then to continue with, here we can see the educated people and grassroots people, and then the healthy people healing the world. This was a term that Laura came up with in the research and refers to healthy, physically healthy humans who are also concerned on the health of both the planet and non-human animals. In the caregiver frame, we thought that it was really interesting to look at it because of care-based ethics and how it centers in a non-violent and more daily basis kind of activism. Then there are frames of showing emotional traits, rational traits, and ethical traits regarding who the advocates are. And now, in regards of what the advocates do, we can see here a distinction between welfarist activists and abolitionist activists. Here we want to say that it didn't refer to welfarists as activists who limit to welfare politics, but as activists who use and defend tactics of progression and that are more welfare oriented. But when it comes to abolitionist activists, it has to be stated that even if you use welfare activists, welfare strategies, the final focus or the goal is the abolition of animal exploitation. Then the warfare, non-violence, direct action, and violence terrorism frames overlap but have their own distinctions. Warfare tactics refer to undercover kind of investigations. Non-violence promoters have to explicitly state that they are pro or that use non-violent strategies in order to be coded. And then when it comes to terrorism, we talk about the criminalization being shown in the documentary, either by the documentary makers or people appearing in the documentary itself. Here, the arguments used to convince the viewer are coded in emotional, rational, ethical, environmental, health, and then the other coder that we hired came up with the idea of the economic because it was actually quite present throughout the documentaries. And to finish with what the advocates do, here we find in risk and without risk. We code it as in risk when the activists were in risk of having their own health, security, or even physical or psychological well-being threatened by the actions they were committing. And then finally, non-human animals as activists. This frame was actually coined in 2017 by Burfer and Schatten, referring to the already mentioned documentary Blackfish, in which Telecom and other orcas stories were considered the first activists themselves that initiated all the movement. The original term is whales as activists, but we expanded it towards non-human animals as activists to be able to include other non-humans that were actually coded further. And to finish with, here you can see an overall image of how these different proportions were shown. The most often used one, which was apparent in all the movies, was in all the documentaries, sorry, was using ethical arguments, and the least used one was vegan elite. And here, surprisingly, we could find that non-human animals as activists was more frequent. And the latest movie was appearing, the more often it came up with. So now Laura is going to continue expanding the discussion of the results.
Yeah, thank you, Olatz. Yeah, I forgot to say that in the methodology, we did not only code quantitatively, but we also collect qualitative examples of each frame appearing. So we also kind of make sure that all the frames were connected, really. No? So yeah, this is like a brief explanation of the overall results, and we select the image of Peaceable Kingdom because it's a good example of how all of them are present. So we see that in the majority of the documentaries, there's the presence of a pluralist approach in communication. That means a combination of ethical, rational, and emotional claims, both in the representation of the activist profiles and also in the arguments used by activists. But there's an abundance of ethical arguments, sorry. Then there's also a profound sense of social justice and abolition of animal exploitation in the analyzed sample is much more present than, for instance, welfare, as Olatz was explaining. Then we see how the activists are also presented as grassroots people, and also how it's very common to present activists as caregivers, especially in the case of animal sanctuaries and shelters, but also on companion relationships at home and family kind of relationships. Then we see that the convert frame was from the start and still is a very common resource in the animal advocacy documentaries. And then there's also an abundance, especially of the activist representation as taking low risk actions. Now I'm going to discuss briefly the evolution of frames over time, because we realized that the majority of the 28 frames found in our sample were equally distributed in time, but we found 5 exceptions. So on one hand, we have these 3 frames: advocates made in real time, healthy people healing the world, and also the use of environmental arguments, that were frames appearing mostly around 2009, 2010, and they were almost non-existent before. On the other hand, we have the freedom fighter profile and also the advocates engaged in direct action as frames that stopped appearing almost after 2010, 2011. So some of our thoughts about how this change is produced, for instance, for the advocates made in real time, which refers to this frame where the narrator of the documentary is becoming vegan or is living, experimenting a transformation during the documentary. We think that this frame is very connected with the popularization of veganism and the social need of role models and personal experiences to make changes, to feel this identification, and especially in a moment where social networks and personal profile are very, very common and very used to spread veganism. Then we also found this frame, healthy people healing the world, which implies a shift, a change in the perspective from a concept of physical individual health. It comes to a holistic health approach, which is also interested on food access, labor rights, environmental destruction, and animal exploitation, and structural racism. So it's like the idea of the world is sick and therefore we can heal it also from our own experience and our own behavior. And we think that this frame is influenced by projects such as the Food Empowerment Project, and also certain intersectional approaches to veganism, as for instance, scholar Brice Harper, and particularly in the US, where food access and food deserts are very common. Then we also found that there was an increase of environmental arguments, and we see that as part of a trend that is being more and more visible within the animal advocacy movement in general. So in documentaries, we can also see how this trend is reproduced, and especially for the cases of the agribusiness and the food industries. Regarding the frames freedom fighter and direct action that disappeared after in the last year, they were not very represented. We think that could be because, as I mentioned, the popularization of veganism, like in this trend, it looks like for some people with no prior political interest, this kind of action and representation could be considered distant and even an extreme referent. And also we consider that to represent direct action means also to create a broader questioning of justice, legality, the establishment, power structures, and also industrial complexes, as for instance, presented by Stephen Best and Anthony Nocella in their volume, Terrorists or Freedom Fighters. And then we also realized that activists were represented in a vegaphobic frame, as analyzed, for instance, by Cole and Morgan for the UK press. And there's also a repression and a criminalization of activism. So we think that activist self-representation maybe wanted to omit that kind of stigma that was already hegemonic and present. And for that, we found Richard White's analysis very enlightening. So he mentioned how veganism changed toward this activist veganism that was more aligned with the original term coined by the Vegan Society, was moving towards a more lifestyle or corporate kind of veganism. So I'm gonna directly read his quote because I think it's very clear and it's very connected with this change in representation. He says, "Vegans were caricatured as anything from weird, irrational, extreme in their attitudes and belief, to individuals who loathed society, were misanthropic and intent on pursuing violent forms of direct action and liberation. Now, uncoupled from its radical heart, articles promoting lifestyle veganism emphasize that veganism is no longer extreme. The focus consequently shifts towards promoting the health and lifestyle benefits of going vegan and neither neglecting or diminishing ethical motivations, framed exclusively as animal welfare issue and never animal rights."
2 minutes to go.
Okay, thank you. To conclude, we see that finally documentaries depict advocates as an enactment of compassion, truth, nonviolence, and justice. That were the values that we were analyzing, and for that, for its value, we found certain frames that were more connected to this representation. So for compassion, for instance, we found the use of ethics, also the actions both risky and non-risky, and the frames of activists as caregivers. For truth, we underlined the representation as grassroots people, the abolitionist frame, the convert frame, and then for nonviolence, the nonviolent promoters frame, caregivers, and also healthy people healing the world. And for justice, we found the frame social justice, like animal liberation being framed as part of a broader social justice struggle, advocates as freedom fighters, and the frame of direct action. And of course, also non-human animals as activists. And just some thoughts to finish. We have found that during the whole process of the research, we have been like a witness of this diversity within animal advocacy documentaries, and also that we see how the unshared meanings and ideological disputes around different concepts such as veganism, anti-speciesism, and activism were negotiated through activist self-representation. For instance, even for us, sometimes it was difficult to say, okay, what is exactly an activist? Who is considered an activist and why? And we think that that reflection is very interesting for us because you cannot be easily ideologically neutral in this analysis. And of course, we also think that the representation of nonviolent direct action in animal advocacy documentaries is still highly important and needed. Also, especially to be in solidarity with those activists who are suffering from criminalization and repression. Then we also celebrate the representation of non-human animal agency and resistance in the frame non-human animals as activists, because we consider, of course, that who better than themselves to represent their own struggle against oppression. And here we have the example of Tilikum, who fight very hard against his oppression and sadly died in an aqua prison, but instead he was able to make a lot of change. And then we also think that in this speciesist and anthropocentric society, the role of animal advocates allies with animal liberation is still very important because they compel society to recognize the injustice perpetuated against them. And that's why activist representation in documentaries matters, no? Because animal advocates are role models and speakers that inspire compassion, truth, nonviolence, and justice. And we wanted to finish with this image that means until every cage is empty, and it was from a protest here. And that's it. And thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your feedback.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Olatz. Fantastic. Okay, so we move on to our final paper from this for this panel. And I am introducing Lynda Korimboccus, who holds a master's in anthrozoology and has an academic background in philosophy, politics, psychology, and sociology. An abolitionist, vegan, and grassroots campaigner since 1999, her research interests centre on how children are taught to view animals so they remain comfortable with their edibility and exploitation. Lynda teaches sociology at West Lothian College, Scotland, and is editor-in-chief of the Student Journal of Vegan Sociology. And Lynda's title of her paper is Mixed Media Messages, Representation of Non-Human Animals on Children's TV. Over to you, Lynda.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping you can see this full screen because I had a bit of a nightmare.
We can see it.
Fantastic. Firstly, thanks to EACAS for this amazing conference and for letting me give this talk at the end of what's been a brilliant couple of days. There's so many conferences I've been able to attend this year, either presenting or just as a delegate. And I think it's really opened accessibility for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to travel to attend these things or get time off work or whatever. Anyway, I digress. So yeah, this is kind of straightforward. It's the clues in the title. I'm going to be discussing some past research, some recent research, and what I'm going to be moving on to. And it's all linked to do with little people, essentially, and how we need to maybe start with them to make changes. Apologies for the quality of this picture, but it was a pretty good one. I just couldn't get a decent version of it. This is depicting the meat paradox, which is a common contradiction that many people suffer between the beliefs they hold about animals, about loving animals, but also at the same time, the behaviours they display towards the animals of, well, eating them, okay? So being responsible for killing, if not directly, then indirectly by purchasing and consuming products. So we love animals, we eat animals, and this is commonly referred to now as the meat paradox. It affects a lot of food practices across the world, not just in the so-called Western world. There's a lot of background to this. The meat paradox as a term was coined by Steve Loughnane and his colleagues some time ago now. And this is just kind of highlighting this difference. But this idea really comes from what's known as cognitive dissonance, which is an idea that's been around for decades, actually. And it's just applying it to the use of animals. There's a whole bunch of other research that's been done to link our behaviours with our beliefs, or that dichotomy across time, and I've given some examples here, and all of this feeds into what it is that I'm going to be talking about. So it could be that we just categorise some animals as for eating and others as for having at home, and others for hunting, chasing, going to watch, whatever. These are just norms that we're taught. We categorise them because we were taught what the category different species belong in, and we pass that on to our youngsters, and so the cycle continues. So these social norms, these social mores, are just the things people just expect that this is normal, and this normative behaviour is what leads to these kind of challenges and contradictions. So there's comprehensive literature, including all this stuff. Hans Rothgerber talks about the reasons people give for justifying their meat eating. And there's 9 different strategies. They vary, but they're also linked to sometimes just the fact that, well, people just don't want to know any better. Or Vasil was discussing last night this idea of you know, you can wake someone who's sleeping, but you can't wake someone who's pretending to sleep. So a lot of the strategies that people use for eating meat are linked to the fact that they would rather not know. They're happy in their ignorance, so to speak. Melanie Joy, about 10 years ago now, was discussing carnism. She coined that term, as far as I'm aware. And again, this is, you know, this ideology that's kind of ever present as to what is and isn't acceptable behaviour. And linked to that is Jared Piazza and also Steve Lockman's work on the 4 ends of meat eating. Again, the justification people give: meat eating is natural, it's normal, we need to eat it, otherwise we'll die of some kind of unimaginable lack of some vitamin or other. And they added to Melanie Joy's 3 ends the niceness of it. Some people just like eating it, and it's a very difficult argument to have with them when they're anyway, I'll get to that. Sometimes it's about language. Most of the language that's used in human-to-human discussion where animals are involved are quite pejorative. So we'd use the terms like, you know, she eats like a pig, implying that that's a negative thing, and he's just chicken, so he's just afraid to try something. So all of these things and more fed into the idea of this contradictory behaviour. What I chose to do as part of the Masters, actually, and it was published last year, I was very, very pleased with that, was look at things to be a bit more species specific, because a lot of these examples would say, okay, so we love a dog, but we eat a cow, but very little, although it's been mentioned in some literature, would discuss the same species. So we love pigs and we eat pigs. So looking at that a little bit more. If we'll move on, I don't know, here we are. So then I came up with, I just thought I'd use some of that pejorative terminology. Pig ignorant, the PEPPA pig paradox. Having to present so much on this means I really wish that I'd used less alliteration, however I did. So I took all that existing literature and applied it to this idea of the species-specific contradictions. Peppa Pig, for those of you uneducated in the way of children's television, is an incredibly irritating character, loved by many very young children across the world. Actually, she was created in the UK, but she has worldwide appeal. There's not many countries that don't subscribe to her in some way, shape, or form. A bit more about the paradox in a minute, but essentially, as an overview, people love the show, children love that show, they love Peppa Pig, they've got t-shirts and all this kind of stuff, but they also are fed. I say they eat foods, they do eat foods, but they eat the foods they're fed. So this comes from caregivers. They eat foods made from body parts of pigs, whilst at the same time sitting with a Peppa Pig t-shirt on or watching the show even. Sometimes kids have had confessions made to me about people sitting at breakfast time with a bacon roll in their hand, watching Peppa Pig with their children. And again, this goes back to cognitive dissonance. How do you resolve that then if people don't see that as a problem? For some, it's just easier not to think about it. What led me to this was, well, I have a now 7-year-old daughter who adored PEPPA. Apparently it's too babyish for her now, but in any case, we were at a couple of shows. It was a live show. I don't know if you can see down here on the bottom right. It's not really a live show. It's not actually Peppa Pig. Clearly, it's people with puppets. We went to that, and at the same time, as we were sitting there, and there was all these other children also eating ham sandwiches at the break of the show. Thought that was odd. We went to the first cinema experience of Peppa Pig, which was, you know, a bunch of shorts put together for children to go and watch, and they were dancing about the cinema. It was all lovely. But you could get a hot dog on the way into the show, as you can do in many cinemas, certainly in Scotland. You can go to Peppa Pig World here, and it'll cost you more than £120, like 100 euros or thereabouts. I'm not sure of the other denominations of money. Anyway, you can go there and spend a day there, and there are some meat products on that menu, which is a bit of an issue. So I was quite fascinated by this. What is going on here that people don't see that? Is it because they don't see Peppa Pig as an actual pig? And thankfully for me, Brett Mills had already dealt with this issue in his book about animals on TV. But she is, as he put it, her piggishness is inescapable. She's most definitely, her and the family are very pig-like on screen. So it's probably not that then. What's happening here is that pigs are accepted as food, certainly in Scottish culture for sure. This is normalised through the socialisation process that starts well, before we're even born, but let's not go into that. But whatever the dominant ideology is of the time, i.e. these animals are food and these aren't, it just prevails. It just continues. It's reinforced by other agents of socialisation, including the media and so on. People kind of, just as I spoke about before a little, the reality of that is kind of glossed over by people who are responsible for kids. But the education system, which I'll speak about shortly, and other agents like the media in particular, reinforce these ideas through the shows that kids watch, what they're taught about animals and so on. I even make an argument in a paper coming out this summer, although I've changed the terminology to avoid upsetting too many people. I shouldn't have really. That there's a case to be made that this exploits the children as well as the eaten animals. The eaters also are not being given the opportunity to make a choice that they possibly would, because kids are really, generally speaking, quite compassionate towards animals. Anyway, this paradox is not just a pig paradox. It could be to do with fishes as well. And I had a look at the menu for Deep Sea World, Scotland's national aquarium, although it's been shut because of the pandemic for a while. You can go to the aquarium, look at the fish, and then go to the cafeteria and eat fish fingers or order fish and chips, which I thought was a little bit odd. Recently too, for another presentation, I looked at chickens in particular. And again, as with Eric, I don't want to just read things out, but it's a really interesting quote from Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals. So when I was 9, I had a babysitter who didn't want to hurt anything. You know, chicken is chicken, right? My brother and I looked at each other, our mouths full of hurt chickens, and had simultaneous, how in the world could I have never thought of that before? And why on earth didn't someone tell me moments? I put down my fork. He never ate chicken again. His brother, on the other hand, did, but that's a discussion for individual psychologists, I think, to discuss. But it's really interesting that something so obvious. Chickens are, I mean, they're called chicken. It's not even like it's a different word, like we say bacon for a pig. There are some that argue the plural is missing, so we say chicken rather than chickens. But yeah, really powerful stuff if only people would let their kids know. What they do tell their kids through the education system is chickens are for our use as other animals are. So I'm using chicken as an example here. The Almond Valley here, we've got a couple of chicks. A lot of these city farms and whatnot will have children visit them, or will have will bring animals to schools, for example, introduce them to them, and they all very cute, and the kids love them and stuff. And then they go home and eat eggs or eat chickens. But this is educational, right? Apparently, there's a food pyramid that my daughter was presented with actually quite recently. And most of it, I would say, other than the photos, most of it from in terms that they were to label them. So this is fats, this is proteins. I'll skip this for the moment. You'll see what I'm getting at surely. Carbohydrates, fruit and vegetables. Here, though, what it should say is probably calcium, but it doesn't. What they were to answer was dairy. So again, we're in issues. Here's the protein thing. There's a little handful of nuts there, and everything else is animal produce. Finally, chickens. Oh God, that was my wee fancy bit. Chickens give us eggs and meat. I mean, that it's not a drumstick, is it? It's a leg. So anyway, we don't talk about things like that. And some recent research talks about how kids really believe that. I'll read a quote from here. Humans and animals are engaged in a mutually beneficial relationship where animals give products in exchange for food and protection. So, oh, thanks for looking after me, sir. Here's my egg, or here's my, take my wing, right? The excretions, the lives themselves are willingly surrendered somehow according to, but no wonder kids think that, because that's what they've been taught. Anyway, getting back to where I was going with this anyway, and the whole idea of media, which I am getting to, I promise. Food animals then are kind of, when they're alive, they're objectified and invisible. This is taken from Kate Stewart and Matthew Cole's work. They're down here, so they're objectified in terms of the quadrant they're in, and we don't see them. We tend not to see them anyway, or you see them in the field and you think it's all lovely and they're very happy. Once they've been killed for food, they end up as visible, you know, shrink wrapped in a tray, but they're still objectified. Nobody really sees animals as subjective beings with an interest in continuing to live. A lot of that is to do with, well, this is linked to, you know, where we get to then, where kids will be eating stuff. Usually it's not good for you. Hello, honey. Not that's not good for you, but at the same time, loving animals on the other side of things. I'm going to be talking about you in a minute. I hope that's okay. All right. Small vegan person. Okay. Here's some of the movies and programs that kids watch. Media have a great responsibility here for what we learn about different animals. A pluralist would say, well, this is only provided because this is what kids want to watch. It's a, you know, supply and demand issue. A conflict theorist would look at this a little bit more as this is how to make more money out of animals without even having real animals involved, power relations and so on. Anyway, what's also in the media, as well as all this stuff about, you know, these cute animals and everybody loves them and people have their favourites and whatnot. And you can add Peppa Pig to that bunch. Obviously, she's not a chicken, but we'll get them. But at the same time, this is also the stuff that the kids see in the media. So adverts for things. I mean, Kate and Matthew spoke about this as well, Chicken Run, and how, oops, went too far, how I think Burger King, or Murder King as I prefer to call them, had Chicken Run as part of their promo stuff when the movie came out. Just seems a little bit odd. Anyway, I want to get onto the key reason that I'm presenting this just now. This is the problem. How kids, or it's one of the problems, there are many, there are multiple resolutions to this, but animals are depicted as characters everywhere in kids' media, whether it's online, whether it's, but I'm focusing on TV for the moment. The media influences children. There are many studies to support that. So it probably influences them in terms of their attitudes to animals as well. The fourth point here, young children do find it difficult. I mean, very young children, you know, younger than 10 or thereabouts, find it difficult to distinguish between what's fiction and what's, just give me a second, my darling, okay. Go see Dad. All right. Between fiction and real life. So you've got to wonder that, you know, the representations of animals to them are even more important because they will not necessarily see them as different. So what do they see? How do they view things? what I did in my, because I've not been able to, I've not been affiliated to university, although I'm about to be in October again, I had to work with what I had, which was access to regular TV. So this is one of the first studies to focus just on kids TV. This is the kind of study data, essentially, to summarise, because I don't want to run out of time. I looked at over 300 programmes across 3 different days, 5 different schedules last summer. I focused on mainstream TV that was available to anyone, or most people. If you've got a TV at least, so it wasn't people that could afford to subscribe to Disney, and it took out any kind of class-related difficulties there. And I also excluded anything that was regional only, so BBC Scotland, for example, or Scottish television. I took out the adverts because that's a whole study in itself. So 66 odd hours of broadcasting that I looked at. 4 in 10 shows had animals as a lead character. This is how popular they are for kids. With another 10% where animals were present and relevant or were discussed, maybe farming programs or whatnot. And I only counted some of the shows once, so actually the figures in reality are a little higher. Alvin and the Chipmunks, as an example, which is one of my daughter's favourites, was on 19 times across the sample, which is ridiculous, however. What I saw was a lot of anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism, as you would imagine. Humans as being some kind of superior being, and where humans were included. And where they weren't, the animals themselves were humanized, or the humanized animals or animalized humans, it's difficult to know necessarily, but they were thingified, certainly. Okay, so what I did here,
2 minutes.
Sure, that's great. Okay, thanks. I looked at how often they were represented in their true form, and it was very little, as you might imagine. Whether or not they were dressed in human clothes, whether or not they expressed themselves as humans would, walking on 2 legs, and maybe facial expressions, body language, and whether or not they spoke in the human language or in the language of the viewer. In most cases, and interestingly, always with food animals, most of this was the case. But this distracts kids away from what's really happening with animals, because all they're seeing is this representation of them, and bearing in mind that they find it difficult to distinguish between them. This was really important. Some audience reception research would be required here to fully to fill this out a little bit more. So, what do the kids think? I'm saying what I think they think, but I don't know. I'm not them. But again, between universities, solitary scholar at the moment, ethically that would be difficult to do, but I plan to at some point. But here's the problem. They're taught that animals are lovely, they're cute, but they're also taught that animals are food, sometimes the same animals. And here's an example here. I'll skip down. I've mentioned the critical animal media studies, which is so vital to getting to the bottom of what's going on and to start to change how the media represent things so that we can create more compassionate children in the future. One of the ways to do this then is to address how they're taught. So instead of having egg hatching projects at school, there are these, I think you can see my cursor moving around. And the bottom right here, there's this Olatz plastic, which is not ideal in terms of environment, but I guess you would only have to buy 1 set per school maybe. You can buy this set of eggs, and every day you would open the egg to see what the stage the chicken would be at had it been a real chicken, rather than chickens being left over the weekend hatching and there being nobody there to care for them, as well as the ethics of doing it in the first place. Perhaps instead of taking kids to zoos and safari parks, they can go to, this is a great example of a vegan run sanctuary very near us that we love and support very much. Take them to a sanctuary, have the sanctuary come and speak to them about what happened to these animals and why they're there. Things are changing. There are many more resources available. And the link to the environment here is there as well. I've mentioned the Oxford University study. A vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth. Now, with kids being taught so much about recycling, reducing, reusing, all that stuff, it's almost like a no-brainer that it would be part of this. The resources themselves are shifting too, which is great. And Vegan Inclusive Education is a new project launched last year in the UK. that I'm working with to try and you know, encourage the curriculum to be much more animal friendly. Thankfully, things are changing, and I've only got a couple more slides and then I'm absolutely done. In the future, though, we can't change things unless we start to change the beginning. So this is a photo of Maya, who you just saw popping in there with her fantastic vegan t-shirt on. So what I'm hoping to do now is a two-pronged approach. You deal with the structures that are responsible for the normative practices, but also we need to look at what it's like to be a young vegan in Scotland or elsewhere. I'm hoping to extrapolate this ideally. What's going on? What does it feel like? We're trying to be inclusive and diverse as a nation, as a globe now. You've got to look at the systems that children are exposed to. If we can normalize veganism a little bit, raise awareness of it, have it in everyday discourse within the education system, maybe we can raise awareness of it, allow veganism to be easier, perhaps even encourage it to be more well utilised across schooling. So that's my PhD, which I'm hoping to start in October, and with Kate Stewart and Matthew Cole. I'm very, very lucky. Anyway, I am over time, so I'll finish up there. I feel like I rushed the last couple of minutes, so I apologise for that. Thank you for listening, and you can contact me anytime with any questions or comments, or ask them just now, and any references you'd like more information on. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Lynda. Thank you. Right, so we have 17 minutes left for questions. So I know that we do already have a question. Here, so actually from Lynda to Eric. Lynda, do you want to say?
I can ask him directly now.
Yeah,
I didn't want to forget the question.
rather than me read it out. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I loved Eric's presentation about, darling, okay. There's a lot of people who oppose service animals, and I'll just read it out. Often when you oppose it, you're met with this argument that these dogs love to work, it's what they live for, they really, you know, it gives them joy, therefore why would you want to take that away from them and the people? So what's an appropriate response to that might sit better than a CAS or abolitionist response, which is what I try to do, but it doesn't always sit well?
Yeah, I have no idea. The thing that we're getting at, or that I've been struggling with, is that these dogs were literally bred, they're only existing to serve this purpose. And so the idea that you'd be told, well, if not for this work, which they love, this dog would not exist, because they are literally bred so that they can serve this human that relies on their services. And so if it's debating whether living for this purpose of work is better than not permitting life to exist in the first place, it's also this interesting dynamic between how do you advocate on behalf of disabled people and deny them services, because you might be told that you're denying somebody services so that they can participate in society, in civil society, as opposed to animal rights. And then you get into weird reasons, you know, this is why the law degree sometimes comes in handy, which is that it took so long for disability rights to take the floor, and it's the same kind of reasons why animal rights have taken centuries to develop, is that people have to speak on behalf of a lot of these vulnerable and marginalized populations who have been exploited because they cannot always speak for themselves. And you have to, as a human, you have another barrier, which is delineating the rights for an animal that is bred to respond to work positively and say they're not really happy, or you have to, Lynda, you're going to be upset that there's no answer, but also you're going back to grad school, so now you have your first mission once you're there. Yeah. So it's, again, I think that question is this one little question that raises so many gray areas in so many places, and I wish I had an answer for you.
If
but
you can let me know then.
I have your email address, so you're not safe anymore.
All right, that's fine, no problem.
Thank you for the question.
So do we have questions? Can't see anything else in the chat. You could use the little hand icon, that would be great. Or just lift your hand, that's fine. Eric, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was going to throw it back at Lynda since she had, so I thought it was great. I really want one of those pink t-shirts now. So I live in Buffalo, New York, which I think is only really culturally known for Bills fans, which is our American football team, which are, I'll leave the Googling to you guys, and chicken wings or buffalo wings. And so when you were talking about just bacon, or these euphemisms or these polite ways of calling food products not by their name, I thought of two things, which is, first of all, wings are only wings here because buffalo wings is why would you're here already, and then chicken wings is just why you say wings and you remove the animal from the whole conversation, which I mean just further substantiates what you said. But I also was reminded of two stories from two different friends, but it's the same story, which is when they were little kids, and they were given chicken fingers, which was always on the children's menu at any McDonald's. They both cried because they thought it was chicken fingers, and it's this idea that, and then the parents in both ways say, no, it's not really the fingers, it's just the chicken. And for some reason, and the way that a breaded circle now doesn't look like a chicken, and it's no longer a finger, so the child is kind of told by this authority figure that it is somehow independent of the animal. And I'm not, and again, it kind of gets back to the question you asked me, which is how do you tell parents without going straight for the kill of you're playing a part in global warming by feeding this beast, and then how do you, I mean, you've a child, we just saw your, I mean, how do you go about telling your child either not to eat something, or to, if you are a family that say there's a way to responsibly eat meat, to soften that to a crying child without really distinguishing a chicken from the chicken finger, or what you're eating from the life that it symbolizes.
I think I know what you mean. Maya's been vegan since birth, so I mean, we could ask her what she thinks, I suppose. I've always been kind of age appropriately introducing her to the reality of something, so that I see there's a question there about looking for some advice on. Just give me a second. Yeah, I mean, I wrote a report one time called "Fish Don't Have Fingers" because there's this kind of fish fingers, and it's like complete contradiction in terms. And then there's the absent reference. So you're presented with this beige food that resembles nothing like the original being, which is fair enough. Maya's never, the only thing Maya's ever been upset about is that the other kids at school are not vegan rather than she is, which is really lovely. That was a discussion I thought I was going to have. I think the biggest challenge is to counter, and this is why I think this study I'm about to start is so important, is to counter the fact that that's unhealthy. How could you force your views on your children like this? Somehow that I'm removing choice from her, when choice was removed from me too. I was raised eating meat and I didn't get a choice. It's just, that's what you do, the best you can for your child. You do the thing that's the healthiest for them, that's going to make them, I mean, whether or not it makes her happy or not. Luckily, with the lifestyle veganism that's happened in the last couple of years, like this boom and explosion of vegan food everywhere, I guess she's not going to be excluded when she goes out with her friends, as when she's a bit older, whatever fast food joint they go to, although I kind of hope they won't, but they might. So I suppose that's going to be easier than if when I first went vegan 20 odd years ago. There are some great books. I gave a talk, I was part of a discussion on the Animal Rights Show a few weeks ago that discussed literature, children's literature a little bit more. And there's a lot of great books out there that you can help discuss the realities of what's happening to animals in an age-appropriate way, because you don't want to scare them. But at the same time, I think we do need to be honest with them. There's anecdotally, you know, I've heard about, oh, is that lamb at the farm the same as the lamb that we eat? No, it isn't. Just eat it. Just, you know, yeah, it is the same. Well, it's not the exact same one probably, but yeah, I think we need to be more honest and open and be willing to have difficult conversations. But that's tricky, particularly if you don't have the knowledge or the background to be confident to do it.
Lynda, there is a question about in the chat at the moment from Ilana, asking for, currently pregnant with twins, wants to raise them vegan. Any advice? Feels resistance from partner and social group to the idea. Are there any academic studies to look into to counteract the argument that it's unhealthy to make a child a vegan?
I think the first place to start, thanks for the question, is the World Health Organization, the British Dietetic Association, and various other organisations, which you can find through the Vegan and Vegetarian Vegan Foundation. In fact, you could email me and I'm happy to give you loads of links. It's widely accepted now by health experts, regardless of the ethics, that a plant-based diet is as wholesome, if not more so, for all people at all ages and stages. But it's not widely publicised. Usually it's just the kind of lifestyle veganism, and here's, you know, a vegan version of this nugget or that burger. So there is stuff out there. It still is an understudied area, I think, in terms of evidence directly from, you know, actual little vegans like this person over here. Unfortunately, it's the first thing people say, you know, if she sneezed, oh, it's because she's vegan and she needs some, you know, that's always the case. But I appreciate the resistance. My husband is not vegan, but he's vegan at home. That was the deal before we got together, or it wouldn't have happened. I also, we established that we would be raising our child vegan when I found out I was pregnant, or, I mean, prior to that, we'd had a discussion, if I fall pregnant, then this will be a vegan child, or I'm not having a baby. So on blackmail, resort to blackmail, that might work. But yeah, there's not enough, although I'm aware of some things. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but if you want to get in touch, I'd be happy to dig them out and send that over, and good luck, because I think you just have to be positive, get the knowledge together to feel more confident and challenging the things that will inevitably come your way. And I'm happy to help for sure.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? We still have 6 minutes left. Do we have any questions for Laura and Olatz? I'm just checking to see if I can see any hands. Okay, well, I do have a question for you, Laura and Olatz. So obviously I realised that you've been focusing on documentaries. I was wondering whether you were aware of any correlations between the representations of activists within the documentaries and those in non-documentary films. Did you find, or have you been aware of any kind of correlation at all in terms of similarities, in terms of the framing?
Well, that's a very good question. But the truth is that we have not examined any non-fiction film. So I'm not sure how to answer it, because I don't really have the like this information actually. But I think it changes a lot. And also I think there's not, at least I don't know a lot of films that represent animal activists, but not on a documentary kind of frame. So for instance, this Okja, this new film, that could be a good example, but I don't know. can't answer because I didn't compare it and examine those films, but thank you for the question.
I'm sorry, it was a very unfair question. I do realise it was slightly. Yeah, I was just thinking of films like Okja and Fast Food Nation, which do have representations of animal activists in them. I was just wondering if you perhaps had thought about any kind of links at all in terms of the framing of them. But I completely understand that wasn't what you were looking at in your own study. So I did go off a slight tangent there, which is more to do with what I'm sort of interested in right now about depictions in non-fiction films. So I was just wondering if you had any ideas. Okay.
I'm thinking that in Okja, for instance, when I watched it, I thought that the activist representation was a bit like ridiculed and ridiculization. Like, I don't know if you share this view, those of you that have watched the film, but for instance, activists, in a way, they were like acting a bit like freedom fighters and so on, but at the same time, like animal rights and their views were a bit ridiculed, I remember, saying things like, I don't remember exactly, but like the tomato, like I cannot eat anything like a seed or a tomato, I don't know. It was like putting their views and their ethics to the absurd, and therefore like not, I don't know, in a way for me that's also stigmatizing their message. But of course I would need to do a more deeper examination to answer it properly. But thank you. Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic to explore.
Thank you.
Maybe may I say something about this, maybe connected with your question? Let me turn on my camera. Because our main aim with this research actually is an advocacy aim. So the idea is to see not just how we represent ourselves or how advocates represent themselves in documentaries, but to be able to produce something fruitful for a more effective advocacy. But of course, for this, there is a link that we have not been able to make, which is to look at the success of documentaries, because that would be very useful for us to know what type of frames are working better in terms of having an impact. But of course, again, that's, as in all research, this is another for another research, but that would probably provide the most practical application of what we have done to see the extent to which each documentary is successful in terms of course, converting people, or if not making people vegan, but at least increasing the awareness of the audience regarding the plight of non-human animals. But then we could make some links, but of course it's very difficult in the case of documentaries, because we can know how much people have watched the documentaries, but that doesn't mean we know the impact on the people. This is really a very difficult link to make. But in any case, that was our main aim with the research, that it's, as you can see, it's unfulfilled. But in any case, we think that it's enough what we have found for, actually for your book, Claire, you know, this is for the book you are preparing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for dropping that in, Núria, that yes, we are preparing a book called Animal Activism on and Off Screen. So thank you for allowing me to drop that in just at the end of this panel conversation as yes, a little bit of forward promotion for it. We are actually out of time. So I would like to thank all of our speakers on this panel. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who has been in attendance for the panel. Can I remind everybody that we are going to go for a roundup into the main room now, and there will also be some poetry from Gordon to finish off the conference for us. But just before we go, if we can show our appreciation and for all of our speakers. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the main room very shortly.